Now, by way of introduction, and before I tell you about our wonderful guests who've joined me today, I want to say two things about translation and PEN. As many of you might know, translation has always been a major part of the PEN program. This PEN World Voices Festival, in fact, was co-founded by a translator, Esther Allen, who was a predecessor of mine as chair of the translation committee. She founded the festival together with Mike Roberts, who was executive director of PEN at the time when Salman Rushdie was president and was also greatly involved in it. Translators are the single largest group among the constituency of PEN, so there's more translators in PEN than there are poets, than novelists, editors, any of that. Lots and lots of us translators, and the PEN Translation Fund, which gives grants to help young translators get started, is half of the PEN endowment, a very large percentage. So the PEN mission and the translation mission very much fit together, and so I'm very delighted that the PEN Festival this year has been offering so much by the way of events devoted to translation. There are 6 events, in fact, of which this is the last one. Now, the PEN Translation Committee, those of you who are PEN members and who are translators, I encourage you to join us. We do a lot of work for translator rights. Michael Moore, my predecessor, who's sitting in the audience, the last chair of the committee, for example, set up a workshop just this December with one of our guests at the far end, Erach Screwvala, who is a lawyer specializing in publishing, but I'll introduce him properly in a moment. One of the projects that we're doing on the PEN Translation Committee is making a model contract for young, and not only young translators, but translators working with publishers to guide them in knowing what to ask from publishers, and we're working on updating that contract as we speak. Now, this is a panel that was billed as a panel about copyright and contracting and translation, translator rights and wrongs, but the PEN World Voices is an international festival, and so we also have some international writer-translators who are not lawyers and are not here to tell us about the law, but are here to tell us about being writers and translators in their respective countries. And we have on my immediate left Evan Fallenberg, who is the author of the novels Light Fell and When We Danced on Water, which I understand is not officially coming out for another 2 weeks, but is nonetheless available for sale outside this door at this very moment, so you can get the advanced copy. Evan is writing in English and is American, right? Yes, American-born, but lives in Israel, so I'll have some questions for him about that. He's the winner of numerous prizes, including the Edmund White Award for Debut Fiction and an American Library Association Award for Literature. His translation of Meyer Shalev's A Pigeon and a Boy won the National Jewish Book Award for Fiction and was shortlisted for the PEN Translation Prize, which is a major translation prize given through PEN. He lives and teaches near Tel Aviv. Sitting to his left, Monika Zgustova was born in Prague and lives in Barcelona. She's published 7 books, including novels, short stories, a play, and a biography. She has also translated more than 50 books, 50, of Russian and Czech fiction and poetry into both Spanish and Catalan, and she also translates her own work, which I will be very curious to hear her talk about later. She has also received numerous awards, both for her own writing and for her translations. On my far, far left, Erach Screwvala is a publishing lawyer who counsels authors, producers, independent record companies, and musicians in the theater and music industries, and has negotiated rights acquisitions for various theatrical and television properties, assisted authors in arranging collaboration agreements and negotiating contracts. His clients include literary translators, including celebrated ones. In this crowd, I need only mention the golden name Edith Grossman, and you will understand that he's a very important person in this field. He also did a wonderful workshop for us at PEN, at the PEN Translation Committee, about contract and copyright issues, and a transcript of that workshop is available on the PEN website. So if you're interested in reading up a bit more, I hope that you will look there. And the way this panel is going to run is this. I'm going to ask our 2 guest author translators a bit about their experience of publishing contracts in their respective countries. I'm going to ask Erach to talk to us about copyright and contracts and those matters. Then I'm going to come back to the authors and ask them about various aspects of their experience of being writer-translators, translator-writers, and also, since both of them are living in situations that neither one of them lives in the country in which he or she was born. I have some questions about that also. And at the end, I'm going to open it up to questions and answers. And I realize that a number of you may have questions about contracts, experiences that you yourself had. And so I want to tell you in advance, or ask you in advance with most heartfeltly, please make sure that your questions are as brief and as general as possible so that we can take as many questions as possible. And I hope you'll have questions for all three of our wonderful panelists. This event is being podcast, and so anything that you shout out may be recorded and placed for posterity on the internet, just saying. Evan, would you start out and tell us a bit about your experience of publishing your own work and translations?
Sure. Hi, good afternoon. I thought this was my portion of this segment of the afternoon will be very, very brief because I live in a country, Israel, that it's the kind of country where everybody knows everyone. And so I've never signed a contract for any translation I've ever done. So that's the short answer, I'd say. A little bit longer than that is, really we rely on each other. I mean, anybody who comes to me, anybody I've translated up until now is either someone I know of, or know through someone else. So it kind of short circuits. I don't know how many lawyers we have who have your speciality, but I can't imagine it's very many in Israel. On the other hand, I work with, because I'm translating into English, so I'm working with publishing houses mainly in New York and London. And of course, with them, there are contracts. But I actually think that when I think about it, I don't think I've ever actually seen any of my contracts. Now that I think I saw one once from London, and I don't even think it had my signature on it or anything. It was just sort of a thing, a kind of a formality, and that's the way I've always treated it. So I just do my job, and luckily, I don't know, maybe I should worry about it now. After this panel, I may be changing the way I work. But so far, it's all been fine, and I haven't had any problems with it. So hopefully, it will continue that way.
Has anyone ever paid you a royalty?
Right. That's a good question. Yes, maybe this is a reason to have a contract. My experience has been that it's always been said to me, American publishing houses do not pay royalties to translators. Bottom line, don't ask any questions, and that's it. And the British do. And so I've grown accustomed to having with the British houses that I've worked with, I know that it's listed somewhere. I've actually seen it somewhere, and I get these statements every 6 months. I've never seen a dime or a pound or anything from those, but I know that that exists. But in terms of my work with American publishing houses, no, the line has always been, and I've actually never questioned it, that there are no royalties for work done with American publishing houses.
Does this also mean you do not hold copyrights for any of these books?
I think I do, actually.
That's good.
But you can see, by the end of this panel, you'll think, why was this guy up there this afternoon? He's got a lot to learn about the topic. But I hope you'll be going through this learning process with me.
Yeah, Evan is actually a plant. We put him here so that nobody will feel bad.
This is going to be a tough hour and a half. I can see it coming.
Monika, would you tell us your story?
Okay, well, let me tell you how it all started, because I think most of you or all of you here are colleagues, right? Our colleagues. So, well, I came to Spain, and when I talked to the people about, I tried to talk about Czech literature, and nobody had any idea about it, So I thought, well, maybe I should do something about it. But I thought that, as a non-native speaker, I wouldn't be able to translate. But anyway, I tried it, and I liked it. And especially, I think when you really like doing something, sooner or later, you will probably do it well, So I did all this work, like translating all these books, mainly from the Czech. I translated all the living classics and the dead classics and the not so much classics yet, you know. So whatever, just name it, you know. Havel, the ex-president, and Harabal and Cunera and so many other people, into Spanish and into Catalan, you know, just to make things more complicated. Because I live in Barcelona, which is a bilingual city, and some people say that it's trilingual or multilingual. Some others say that no, it's only one language, but I consider it a bilingual language, city, and so I work in both languages. And so I took it more or less like sharing my reading experience of Czech literature and partially also Russian literature with the readers. And also, as far as I'm concerned, for me it was like recreation of a work, right? You probably know what I'm talking about, that it's a recreation, so it's a creative work. And so for me, when I started, it was like helping to create the work of art together with the writer in another language, you know, trying to make it sound as close to the language into I'm translating as I can, right? As if it was like born Spanish or Catalan, right? Very often I also asked the opinion of the writers, so this way I got to know many famous writers, Czech writers and some Russian writers as well. And you know, now you said that no contracts and all that. I was also like you. When I was very young, no contracts, you know. Who should bother with, you know, that some kind of like bureaucracy? Out of my way, you know. I don't want to hear anything about it until I had my first problem, you know. And now, so after I had my first problem, I went to a guy like you, to a lawyer, who kind of solved it. He was very nice. He said, "Oh, no, it cannot be. This publisher, how did he do it?" You know. So I like to hear this. Usually, you know, most lawyers are not like that. And so now to avoid all this,
I think we need to know what the problem was.
You know, this is terrible because I'm so positive that I forget about the problems, you know. I just remember that there was a problem, like I just didn't, I didn't read it well. I didn't read it at all. I didn't read the contract, I just signed it. And so I overlooked something, and then probably I did something that I shouldn't have done, but which was normal, which everybody was doing. But then the publisher said, no, how did you do this? And you know, things like that. So I actually do advise you to read the contracts, you know. And to be actually, you know, to be like, really, I look at every detail in the contracts now, because, you know, there can be a detail, usually it's the things written in small letters, you know, in very small letters, which are tricky, right? So look at the small letters, look at the details, you know, and you will avoid problems, and you won't lose money on lawyers, and
Hey,
So the contracting in Spain, there's a lot of negotiation to be done and a lot of details of contracts to be worked out, I assume?
I always do that. As far as my own works, my novels are concerned, and translations also, I always look at it very, very carefully. Almost always I have some correction to be done, you know, and then I feel kind of secure.
Are you allowed to own the copyright for the books you translate?
Yes. I insist on this, you know. Of course, the publishers, especially the corporative ones, they are reluctant to give you this, right? But I insist on this. This is like one thing that I always want to have. This is like to tell them, hey, respect me. you know, I'm not just a slave, you know, so I need a good treatment. So I always insist on this. So these are two things. First, like the royalties, even though most of the writers are translate, it's like they don't sell as much, so I hardly ever get any royalty, but sometimes I do, actually, sometimes I do. There are some works that, you know, sell so well that, you know, after many years, I'm still getting something, you know, like to have lunch or dinner with friends, you know, which is always good. And I also discussed the price, you know, although just to tell you, the last sentence, I don't want to take more space of my colleagues. About the price, it also depends, you know, like who's the publisher. If it's a small and independent publisher, I try to get a subvention, a grant, or something like that, because I know he cannot pay like 20 euros per page. He would get ruined, you know, because most of the books I translate are so good that not too many people read them, you know. Well, you know the story, right? And so I try to negotiate the price, like a good price with the corporative publishing houses, but for the small publishers, I really try to be nice to them, because, you know, also I know what it is like very well, because my husband and myself, we bought a publishing house now, you know, so now I'm on both sides of the story.
So do you automatically offer your translators who work for your publishing house generous contracts, or do you use your knowledge to fight for them?
I try to be in between, you know, because I know what they are talking about, because you really cannot make a very decent living, if you only translate, right? And so I try to talk to them like in a nice way, you know, that, well, lower it a little bit, or I just tell them, why don't you give me the translation and the correction at the same time, you know, so the corrector isn't needed after that, you know, which is like an additional cost.
When you say the corrector, do you mean the copy editing? Or?
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Right. Yeah.
So the translator copy edits himself or herself.
Sometimes, yeah. Like when they insist that they want to earn 20 euros a page, you know, then, I mean, they have to do the copy editing. Yeah.
Thank you, Erach, it's all yours.
I'm sitting here thinking I can't decide what's worse, not having a contract or having a contract and not reading it. And I really don't know which is worse. And before I get into some basic copyright stuff, I will say that in my experience, I've never, for anyone, done a U.S. contract that did not contain a royalty. So Evan, this may be the last panel you get to come on and say you don't do contracts. But let's back up a second. We've talked a little bit about ownership of copyrights. And so I'll just talk briefly about how it comes to be that a translator has something to own. And my discussion will be based on U.S. copyright law, so unfortunately it doesn't help you so much, Monika, in Spanish and Catalan, sorry. But the Copyright Act protects, and this is actually in the Constitution. Copyright law comes out of the Constitution. And copyright law protects what are called works of art fixed in a tangible medium. We don't have to discuss what that means, except to say that when you write a book, that's a work of art fixed in a tangible medium, subject to protection under the Copyright Act. You have we call it a basket or a bundle or a package of rights that you have with that work of art. It includes things like the right of reproduction. You have the right to control copies of your work. The right of performance governs, you have the control over how your work gets performed before a public audience. The right of distribution. It's another right that you have as a copyright owner. That means you get to control how and in what manner your work is sold. So a lot of these rights sort of bundle together. But the most important one, and the one that allows us to talk about copyrights for translation, is that you have the right to make what are called derivative works. So a book gets made into a movie. The movie is a derivative work. It's derivative of the original work of art. Okay? that derivative work, the movie, and in this case we're talking about translated works, the derivative work has a separate copyright attached to it, and you have all of the same rights that the original copyright owner has, with one notable exception, and that is that your copyright depends upon your right to make the derivative work from the original copyright owner. Is everybody still awake? Okay.
I see smiles.
So that's where you get the right to have a copyright because you've made a derivative work of some original work of art, in this case, a book in a different language. So now let's talk, so that's sort of where we come to talking about having something to own. You've got something to own. Now comes the problem of dealing with publishers who don't want you to own it. All right, so we'll talk just for a couple of minutes about, if that's all right with you, we'll talk about work for hire. Have you heard the phrase work for hire before? Is that something that's familiar to you? Okay. This is what I call the front door of taking your thing from you. If you sign a contract that says that you are making this translation as a work for hire, you're basically saying that you own nothing. And that is what I call the front door, the very, very explicit way of a publisher saying, we're not letting you own anything. So how many people have dealt with that by, if you've dealt with that before and you've gotten, if you've dealt with that before and gotten that language out, you probably feel pretty good about yourself. I got the work for hire language out. But now you got to watch out for the back door. The back door says later on, you get to own your copyright, but you assign your copyright to us. How many people have seen that language before? Guess what?
Everybody raises their hand.
If you see that language, you might as well have signed a contract that said work for hire, because basically you've given over your copyright to the publisher. And that's a backdoor way that a lot of publishers use to say, all right, you don't want to do work for hire, that's fine. We'll give you your copyright, but oh, by the way, you're going to assign it to us. And now we own it. So you're in the same position as when you started. But now, if you've dealt with those two things, now you got to watch out for what I call the side door. So you successfully got the publisher to say, all right, we're not going to do work for hire. The publisher says, okay, we won't make you assign it to us. It's going to be a straight license, you own your copyright. But oh, by the way, we're going to license your copyright for as long as the copyright exists. Do you know how long a copyright exists? A copyright exists... No. No. Your life plus 70 years. So through the time you are in the ground and kneel for someone else, your copyright exists. And the publisher owns it. So are you in a different position than if you had signed a work for hire or if you had signed an assignment? No, you're not, unless your contract has language that allows you to get your rights back. Have you heard of the concept of reversion? Okay. Reversion says that if a book is out of print, that you have the right to go to the publisher and say, I want it back. Now you've got your copyright back. Only if you've got those elements in your contract do you really have something that you feel like, I can own it, I can give it to children or my next door neighbor through a will. That's really, and that's a critical part. That's going to be the most important thing if you are reading your own contracts. That's going to be one of the most important things you're going to look out for.
Wow. How many in the audience, having heard that, feel confident that they've been signing good contracts? Oh my God, I see a hand. I see two hands.
Michael, I know why you sign good contracts.
Yes, well, I see we all have a lot to learn here today. That's quite fascinating. Now I'm going to ask these guys some other completely different things. Okay, so.
I have a question. Were you aware of what you just said?
Do I have to admit? A bit of it. I think while Erach was talking, I was thinking maybe in my next life I'm going to ask to come back as a lawyer, be a little bit smarter next round. But, I have to, kind of get myself off the hook just a little bit by explaining one aspect of the way we work in Israel, and maybe this will help to explain why I've been so, seemingly negligent about the whole business of contracts. I learned a few years ago, not all that many years ago, I was sitting at a table at a university speaking with several of my colleagues who translate from English to Hebrew, the opposite direction. And one of the women at the table was a very well-known Israeli translator who'd been translating for 30 years and was head of a translation department at a university. And she started telling a story about how the book she was just translating, she was actually in touch with the author about. And I didn't understand what she was talking about. I couldn't fathom what it was she was saying until I realized that in her 30-year career, she'd never been in touch with one of the authors she was translating. Because when you're sitting in a tiny country with a language base this big, the Grishams and the Rowlings of the world are really not interested in I don't know, maybe they are interested, I don't want to say anything against them, but they don't have the time or the wherewithal to deal with questions from translators from what they consider to be all sorts of esoteric different countries and languages around the world. So I suppose every different author has a way of dealing with that. I know that J.K. Rowling does not answer any translator questions. So I am in exactly the opposite position. When I work with an Israeli author, he or she knows that if I do a good job with their book, they have a chance for an entirely new career and an entirely new financial status. Because whatever they've been selling in Israel, there are very few people who really, I think two writers, maybe three in Israel, who make a living exclusively from their writing. But suddenly, if they find themselves doing well in English, then that's something completely different for them. Which means that I'm kind of treated like a prince in that sense. People are willing to answer my questions whenever I have them. Call me in the middle of the night if you need to know something, kind of thing. And so I've always had this kind of wonderful relationship with my writers, wonderful relationships with the publishing houses, and luckily nothing bad has happened in my career. So I don't know if that exonerates me. I'm going to go home and do my homework from now on. But I think that kind of partly explains that the situation in which I work, my work environment, is a bit different and a bit special, I think, than some other such environments.
And could you say something about what it's like to be writing in English while living in a Hebrew-speaking environment?
Yeah, I was asked many years ago when I first started writing if I consider myself an American writer or an Israeli writer. And the answer was very clear to me. I'm an Israeli writer who writes in English. And we have Israeli writers who write in Hebrew and in Arabic and in Russian and in Polish and in many, many other languages. So I feel myself there is a certain uniqueness. When you think of an Israeli writer, generally the first thing that comes to mind is the Hebrew language, probably second Arabic, and then a slew of other languages after that. So it is unique, it is a bit unusual, and there aren't that many of us. But I find some interesting aspects that connect to it. One is that sometimes I've been credited with really unusual and exciting use of language in my own writing, when I can't be entirely sure that that doesn't come from interference from the Hebrew that I speak on a daily basis and from which I translate. So, I'd like to take complete credit, but I think that sometimes some of my imagery and even some of the syntax sometimes probably derives from the Hebrew that's so much part of my life. And in terms of translation, I find it not just incredibly helpful, I can't imagine what so many of you do, and that is to be living in an English-speaking environment and translating into English from a language that's somewhere out there. I swim in Hebrew every day. It's the language of discourse. It's the language of culture. When I go to the theater or anything else, it's in Hebrew. And so I'm exposed to it all the time. And it really certainly helps me, I believe, in my work as a translator.
And within the context of Israeli literature, is your work in English accepted as part of that new canon? How porous is that world?
Now, let me put it this way. I don't remember the last time I checked, but if you Google me in English, there are thousands or tens of thousands, I don't know, I don't really know. If you Google me in Hebrew, I think like 37 hits or something like that. And the thing is, yeah, I know, and it's funny because it's where I live. You know, I'd like that sort of connection more. I have a great connection to the world of Israeli literature and Hebrew literature because I work with writers. Not only do I translate them, but I have a studio in the garden of my home. It's a studio for writers, and I have a literary series. And I invite a mix of Anglo and other writers and Hebrew writers whose English is good enough to do a program, which is most of them, for my English-speaking clientele. So on the one hand, I'm really involved in Hebrew and Israeli literature on a deep level. And on the other hand, I'm different. And so if you're an average Israeli and you're not up to reading a book like mine in English, and that's not on a bestseller list, you know, not one of the imports that Israelis are used to, you know, kind of an easier read, let's call it, then you're probably not going to know who I am in Israeli culture.
Have your books been translated into Hebrew?
No, the first one has been out for a couple of years. The second one, as you mentioned, isn't out yet. So to explain, I think, just give you a little bit of background why that may be. I was at the MacDowell colony a number of years ago, and one of my fellow residents was a Canadian playwright who said to me, I have one novel out. Can you explain something to me? It has been picked up and translated into exactly one language, and that's Hebrew. Why? And when he told me a little bit about the book, I said, oh, I know exactly why. As he explained to me, it's a book that takes place in a tiny town in Canada. There are no Jews, no Israelis. I said, oh, well, that's the reason. It's the most exotic thing that an Israeli could want to read about. Snow, cold, no Jews, no Israelis. You know, Canadian mentality is about as far as you can get from Israeli. That's what people want to read about. And my books take place in Israel. So, you know, it's more of the same as far as maybe your average Israeli is concerned.
Well, maybe next time we have you back to the festival in a couple of years, we'll be talking about the Hebrew translations of your books.
Inshallah.
Yes. Monika, could you talk a little bit about your translations of your own work and your translations of others' work and what the difference is between those?
Okay. First of all, I wanted to tell, that right now I'm writing a book about the Gulag, you know, and so it's all in snow and ice and all that. So maybe that would be a good book to translate.
We'll be happy to have it in Israel.
Well, I must say that it's very different to translate other people than to translate yourself. Actually, I must admit, I usually don't say this to anybody, but I think that there are no reporters, no journalists, nothing like that here. So I will just admit that I hate to translate myself, you know. But still, at the same time, it's my profession, and I know that I have to do it, that probably another person wouldn't do it as well. Maybe he would, but I just don't trust him, you know? I'm a translator, and I don't trust the others, you know? Because I know myself, the mistakes we can make, you know, the kind of little shifts of meaning and all that, you know. And also because very often the translations of my books are made into other languages, usually from Spanish. So that's why I'm very, very careful about it, you know. Although sometimes it is also done from Czech. But I must say also that it's not really translations what I do of my work, you know. That's the good thing about it, you know. The bad thing about it is that it's you, and it's like as if you were looking at yourself all those hours that you are sitting in front of your laptop. It's like as if you were looking at yourself, you know, all the wrinkles you have and all that in front of a mirror, you know. So it's not a nice feeling. That's the bad part of it. But like the good part of it is that you don't have to translate it. You can make a version of it, you know. You can say it in completely different words. You can omit a page, and you can do these things that you would never be able to, that you cannot do when you translate somebody else, right? Because then you have to be absolutely faithful and all that. So this is wonderful. Now it's like you're free, you're flying, and you know you can do. So what I do, I do a recreation, a version actually of the Czech version. It's also very enriching, I must say. That's the good part of it, right? What you do is, okay, you sit with the first version, which is the Czech, and you start translating it. I translate it, you know, I'm a real masochist. I translate myself into Spanish and into Catalan also, you know. So, but the good part, as I said, you know, everything has a little bit like two parts of the two viewpoints, right? So the bad part is this, that whenever a normal writer would say, the novel is done and now I take it to the publisher and, you know, I don't have to think about it anymore. So there I sit down and I have two versions to make out of that, you know. That's pretty horrible. But the good thing about it is that my books get published in 3 languages immediately, okay? That's great. And also that I can see, when I translate my book, I can see the drawbacks, I can see the flaws, I can see the little things that are not completely logical, and you know, the sentence that isn't well built and things like that, right? So I can, you know, you go so deeply into the text that I translate myself in the first version of the text, you know, which is, I do it actually also sometimes with the writers. I translate, I think we all do it, you know, right? We probably, some people don't do it and some do. I think it's kind of like our obligation to do it because that's the way I feel. And that's why sometimes I'm in touch with the writers. I translate for these things and for other things, you know. I must also, like, among ourselves, there are some writers who don't want to know anything about some possible mistake or anything like that, you know, like for example, my great, wonderful relationship with Mr. Kundera stopped in the moment when I told him, you know what, maybe this isn't the right word to say it, you know. Anyway, so so to translate yourself, it's good that because, you know, you're more free, and it's bad because, you know, you are always like in the same text, and also like you must realize that the kind of liberty you take when you're translating yourself, you must not have it after that when you're translating others, right?
Oh, that must be a danger.
Well, not really, because I think you're so aware of that, you know, when you're translating yourself and when you're translating somebody else. I actually almost always do both, you know, that when I'm not really writing my own work, then I translate my own work and somebody else at the same time. And but I'm always aware of what I'm doing, and actually it's like I feel that it's very, very pleasant to translate somebody else because you are discovering new style, new vocabulary and all that, you know, that you are not dealing with yourself, and because sometimes, you know, your self-esteem can go down, you know, when you're, and also like what I have to say that I think you touched on this point, Evan, that you learn a lot from translating. It's like, for me, I cannot imagine writing without translating, and also the other way around, you know, because actually I translated first. I was a translator, and from that I went eventually to writing, and now for me, like, both are like a part of the same thing, literature.
You must have been very young when you started publishing translations, is that true?
Yeah, I think I was a little bit over 20 or something like that, yeah. I'm not very fond of explaining things like at the bottom or something like that. I think it's really bad for the rhythm of the novel. So I always try to incorporate the meaning somehow in the translation, and I do it with my own work as well as with the authors I translate, because it's true that there are many things that are different from like the Czech culture or Russian culture and the Spanish or Catalan, right? Completely different sometimes.
And you started speaking. Oh, sorry, Evan, you had a question.
No, I was just going to say that's a big issue for me as well. I guess it probably is for most translators, but I'm thinking of it on the level of how to take a text and render it relevant to the new culture, both in terms of the language and the culture, but also to retain something. That's what I'm always afraid of, and I think my best example of that is a book that I translated a number of years ago. You may know, if you don't know the book, you may know the film called Beaufort, by Ron Lesham. It was Israel's. It was one of the 5 Academy Award nominees a few years ago, and the book is told through the first-person narrator, who is a 20-year-old Israeli soldier, and so I had the task of making it sound like a 20-year-old Israeli soldier in English. And my first instinct was to try and find someone, a 20-year-old American soldier, let's say, and work with him, and you know, get the nuances of language and how he would speak. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that that wasn't going to work, because if I succeeded, then it would sound like an American. The character would sound American, and then I would have drummed him out of his Israeliness. And so what I did eventually is I worked with my own sons, one of whom was in the army at the time, and the other was just about to go in. And they knew all the language, all the slang. And what I tried to do was make the soldier seem, you know, he was speaking in English, but I wanted the reader on every page really to remember that this is an Israeli situation and an Israeli who is speaking in Hebrew originally. It's a trick. It's a trick of ventriloquism. I don't know what else to call it. And it's a trick that changes from book to book, but it's there. It's prevalent in every book. And what I love, I think one of the great challenges for me is it happens almost every time that when someone hears I'm translating a certain book, someone in Israel, they'll say, that book can't be translated. It's so Israeli. And I think those are exactly the kind of books that I want to be working on, because if it's too universal, there are probably 10 ways to translate every sentence, and what you get in the end is something very generic. And what I love is the specificity. I mean, what are we really trying to do? Ideally, we should all be reading every book in its original language. It's an imperfect art, what we do. In lieu of that, in the face of the fact that we cannot, all of us, read every book we would like to read in the original language, we're forced to read translations. And those of us who deal with translations try to make those translations, you know, the best that they can possibly be. So what I love about a translation is being able, as a speaker of English in this case, to be able to look at this Israeli book and learn something from it, learn something about Israeli culture that the writer might not necessarily have had in mind when he was writing it. But all of these things seep through if the original writer has done his or her job and the translator has as well.
Can I say something to this? Yeah, I think I agree with this Totally. I think this is very, very important. I think this is really the essence of translation, especially, actually, you know. And for example, when it's the question of translating my own books, as I said, you know, I don't translate it word for word, but I'm very careful about kind of like preserving the smell and the rhythm and the atmosphere and all that, you know, because and I think I'm very happy to have translated one Czech author. His name is Bohumil Hrabal. Some of you might know him. You know, there was some of the movies when there were movies also made out of his books. You know, by Menzel, Closely Watched Trains, or I Served the King of England. Actually, what I do sometimes before I start translating a book, I ask the author how he wants me to translate it. And now I'll tell you what answers I got, okay? But I also do this with my own translators. I always tell them, please don't be too rigorous about every word. It's very important for me that you preserve the atmosphere and you know the specificity of the text, but not every word. Sometimes, you know, you might resume 3 words by one, and sometimes to say one word you might need 2 or 3 words. So just don't be shy and try to be a creator, try to be a co-creator, okay? That's what I tell them
You're
about.
doing translator training.
Right, a little bit, but still I still see them that they are very shy about this, you know. They don't take too much, they don't, it's hard for them to do this, you know, but I try to push them. Because I had this training. I first translated Kundera, and well, as I told you, for quite a few years I was a very good friend of the family. So, you know, we had lunches and dinners together, and I used to see them often. And Kundera was, many of you must have read some of his treatises about translations, right, and about translators. He's really obsessed about translators, and sometimes it's almost insulting, right? But anyway, one shouldn't take it personally because he's really, really obsessed about it. For him, it's very important to have every word translated literally the way it is. Never translate one word by 2 words. You know, every sentence must be exactly the way it is, as if it was philosophy. You know, he treats his books more as if it was like a philosophical treatise rather than a piece of art. And so when I translated him, I was very careful about each and every word, about the slightest meaning and everything else, because, you know, he was sometimes very angry at some of his translators, French translators, for example, that, you know, some of the meaning was a little bit not exactly that, you know. So anyway, but my greatest lesson as a translator, I got it from Hrabal, as I said, because Hrabal told me, do what you want. He would go, I would say, but, you know, can you look at it, for example, here you have a sentence which lasts like 5 pages, you know, and you know, in Spanish or in Catalan, really, it would sound better if it wasn't exactly 5 pages, but maybe, I don't know, instead of one long sentence, it could be 3, you know. He said, do what you want. And always like this, but then when we became closer, then he told me that it would be very important for him that he really trusts his translators, that they know that he's in their hands, and that he trusts them that they will do the best job that they can. And he told me, translate the rhythm. I will read it for you. And then he started reading it for me, you know. And he told me, look, this word is very important, and you know, and this meaning is very important. Or here, can you, here I talk about the beer. Can you smell the beer? I mean, you know, in the translation, the reader has to smell the beer from the page, you know. And so that was, I mean, for me, that was the lesson.
That is so beautiful. Thank you for this story. I just came from the panel with Jonathan Galassi and Joachim Sartorius talking about translating Leopardi, but Sartorius talked about his translating working together with John Ashbery, and Ashbery doesn't know any German, but Ashbery is very interested in being part of the translation process, since he himself is a very wonderful translator from the French. And so Ashbery asked Sartorius to read his translations to him, and Ashbery would then listen to the music of them and the rhythms and comment on that. And they worked together in this way, and that's very much reminding me of that.
Can I just jump in here
Of course.
to make what I think is probably the most important point for everybody to think about? I mean, I'm in awe of what you all do, and listening to this is really impressive to me. And what I find when we turn this talk into contract talk and dealing with publishers, that, you know, the level of art that goes into it doesn't ultimately get reflected in how translators think about their value and their contribution from a contract point of view, from a financial point of view. And, you know, the old joke is, well, you can't make money doing translation. I don't know why that should be. Take what Evan said earlier about, here's an opportunity for these Hebrew writers to have a brand new career, a much larger audience, and you've got to be stuck taking a fee with no royalty. That makes no sense to me. That makes no sense to me.
It doesn't make sense to me anymore either.
Well, and it shouldn't, but this is, I think, the point. The point is that I think my guess is that a lot of people in the audience go into it thinking, well, I've just got to take what I can get and I should be lucky. I should be happy with what I get. You deal with a small publishing house, like Monika says, well, it's a small publishing house and they're doing it. So I don't buy that. I really don't. A good friend of mine said to me the other day, she said, you know, I'm happy to be for sale, but I'm not on sale. And I think that more than anything, more than any of these individual contract points that we may talk about are, you know, a little language here, a little language there. The most important thing is, you know, you've got to go into it with, I think, the attitude that, hey, my work here is valuable, my work here is important. Without me, there is nothing to sell on the street, right? Because, you know, there aren't going to be many people in the United States who are going to read a work in Hebrew. Let's face it. And I think that attitude is one of the most critical things that you all have to remember when you sit down, whether it's with an attorney or not, when you sit down with a publisher to work out a deal. And not necessarily be willing to accept every last little point. Publisher says, well, I can't do this, I can't do that. You know, Penguin is a big company, right? You're working with big companies. Random House is a big company. And even a small publishing house, they're a business. They've taken a voluntary act to acquire a book that they now want to translate. You are going to do an enormous amount of work, and it's obvious it's an enormous amount. Just listening to Evan talk about, well, how do I capture the voice of an Israeli soldier but make him Israeli and not American? And the process, before you even sit down and say, this sentence in English is going to be this, all the work that you put into it, and then you're going to sit down and say, well, okay, well, I'll take, you know, 5,000. You can't do that. I really believe that. Now, let's be honest also that all negotiation is about leverage. Now, let's also be honest of the fact that publishers are going to have more leverage than you. Always. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't take a stand, take a position, and push back and say, listen, what I do is valuable, what I do is important. I work very, very hard at my art because it is an art, and I deserve to be compensated fairly for it.
I agree with you completely. And actually, the discussion we've been having has centered around royalties. And you all now know my position on royalties. But I have taken exactly that stance in saying my time is valuable, my art is valuable. I think I do a good job with the texts. So the way I feel that I need to be compensated is through the fee itself. And that's where I've focused my energies, on the fees. And so I take a very high fee. And so I don't feel like a sucker in this process. Maybe also partly because when you look at numbers, that it's very rare to find an Israeli book that justifies the whole business of royalties. But so I focused my efforts on pushing the prices up. Sadly, I think this is a horrible comment. In that same conversation that I had with those Israeli translators who translate English to Hebrew, I discovered that I charge 4 times what the ceiling for what they can charge in Israel for doing the same work, really. And only because I'm potentially a meal ticket for someone where they are something, again, thought of as kind of esoteric. So it's a shame. There's nothing I can do about that, but what I can do is to try and help raise people's consciousness and expectations about what they should be paying for a translation in any language. And that I have made a real position on. I know for a fact, for example, that I take a lot more money than what the American publishing houses are willing to pay. So there's always a scramble when I'm involved in a book that, where is the money? And I don't back down about this. So, that's my bad.
I didn't mean to pick on you.
No,
I didn't.
No. I deserved it, believe me.
All right, I'm going to break this up. I think the time is ripe for me to open up to comments and questions. Now, this is being podcast, so there are traveling microphones that can be brought to you. Oh, thank you I couldn't see anyone before that because of the lights. So I'm going to take the question in the far back over there. Please be brief. Let us know who you are, and yes.
Hi, my name is Carol Cooper, and I'm a journalist, and my question is a legal question. My thought was that an original work, whether it be by the original author or an original translation, does belong to the creator up until the time that they actually sign their rights away. So that sometimes being without a contract still leaves you room to demand or get your rights because you've never signed them away. Is that true or not?
You get a copyright in a work as soon as you create the work. There's no other requirement other than that. So once you finish writing a book or painting a picture, it has a copyright attached to it that you own. So it's true that if you don't, pick on Evan again, if you don't sign any contracts, you haven't given anything away. So from that standpoint, you've done all right for yourself. So yes, that's correct.
Yes, here in the front.
My name is Ruth, and I'm Israeli.
Wait, we need the microphone because it's being recorded.
Thank you. So my name is Ruth, and I was born in Israel.
Can you hold it so that the microphone gets your voice?
Like this?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. My name is Ruth, and I was born in Israel. I'm curious from the two of you, are you so fluent and so well-versed in the languages that you don't need a dictionary? And if you do use a dictionary, which one would you recommend that's in English Hebrew? I don't know the other languages.
Well, first of all, I'm in awe of Monika, who can manage to translate into a language that's not her native language. Several that are not her native language. I don't think I can do that. I've been living in Israel for 25 years, and I don't trust myself. I speak an excellent Hebrew. I don't trust myself when I put out a letter not to have it looked at by someone. And it's not because I get the words wrong, it's because often I find that my syntax is still rooted in English, and there's nothing I can do about that. Probably nothing. Maybe I haven't tried hard enough. But and that also goes along with my theory about translation in terms of translating into your strongest language. I feel that as a translator, nobody can ever help me render something in the best English possible. If I don't know how to do that, it's never going to be good enough. But I can always get help with the Hebrew. So as I said, my Hebrew is excellent, but there's always going to be something, either a word or a phrase or even a cultural reference, that because I didn't grow up in Israel will not be part of my personal vocabulary. So what I know now to do is I have my consultants on any given project. And they change. As I mentioned, that book about the Israeli soldier, well, my kids were my consultants. And sometimes when I'm translating Meir Shalev, who has an extraordinary level of Hebrew, I can only consult with people who have extraordinary Hebrew and are over the age of 50-55, because they will know his cultural references, and they will have grown up in schools learning the Hebrew as he did. And in terms of dictionaries, I use a number of different ones depending on the text. The Even Shoshan is good for the older Hebrew and the biblical, so I have a whole slew of them, and now online, that's a really big help. I don't even know what I use anymore. I just sort of press buttons and have all the books next to my table. I can't even remember what they all are.
Next, I had one other part. I wanted to know who the Israeli writers are that you say sell in Israel. They make a living by selling their books in Israel. You said there were 3 novelists.
Right. David Grossman, Amos Oz. And then it depends how you count it, because someone like Meir Shalev, he's also a journalist. And that's making your money from writing just as well as writing novels. But they're really, maybe now actually, Et Keret, I suppose, and maybe the field has expanded to 5, but it's not very many. And like most of us in Israel, everybody has a lot of different jobs. So you're lecturing over here, and you're writing a piece for that place over there. Interestingly, though, there are 3 Israeli writers who have regular columns in Italian newspapers. So Italy is a huge market for Israeli literature.
Who were the writers?
David Grossman, Aleph Bet Yoshua, and I think Amos Oz. I think those are the 3.
Why?
Why? I don't know exactly. There are certain European countries that have a focus on Hebrew literature, and Italy is at the forefront.
I learned something new today. I'll take the question here and then the one behind.
Hello, this is Ben. I was born in Germany. I live here in the United States now for the last 12 years. I've got actually 2 questions, if I may. One is a legal question. If you haven't signed a contract yet, you really have no right to translate in the first place, don't you? You have the leverage that the publisher can't take it from you, but then there's no need, and you can't really sell it anywhere else.
Well, it's a technical matter, because as I said, a translation is a derivative work of the original, and to create a derivative work, you do need the permission.
Yeah.
Presumably, publishers don't go commissioning translations without rights. I won't say that it never happens, but presumably they're not doing that.
Okay, thank you. Second question. Both of the writers here, the translators, have lived outside their culture that they were born into. And yet they still, in one case, write in that language, in the other case, translate into that language and write in that language. How do you maintain proficiency? I have lived here for 12 years, and I see my German sliding. Thank you, I appreciate that.
Well, really, languages are completely unpredictable. You never know what's going to happen, right? Don't you think so? I never really thought what would happen to me, or I never planned anything, but right now, for example, I can only write my fiction in Czech. I could try to do it in some other language, but I don't want to, because I don't want to compare myself to Kafka, no way. But I just want to quote him, or give him as an example. Kafka actually wanted to write in Czech. I don't know if any of you know this. He wanted to write in Czech, but his German was, of course, much better, And so to write, you need your best instruments, You really need the automatism that just must come into your head immediately, the word, you're not supposed to think, you don't have to, so that you wouldn't have to think about the verbal tense and, grammar and things like that, just as much automatism as possible, at least in my case. But then, it's really strange and curious to be able to translate into a language which is an acquired language. I know it's a very strange case, but the funny thing is that I wouldn't be able to, or it would take me a long time and a lot of effort to try to translate into Czech, for example, from Spanish or Catalan. It would be very, very strange for me, a strange experience. And then, for example, so I translate into Spanish and Catalan, write in Czech, but then, for example, if I have to write an essay, I cannot write it really in Czech because I studied at the university here in the States, so I could do it in English as well as in Spanish, but not in Czech because I could write like, I don't know, something, a poem, but not but not an essay, right? So you know, so this is the thing about languages. But then, for example, like you talked about how to preserve your native language, right? Well, I preserve it because I work with it all the time, right? I work with it because, for example, when I translate from the Czech, I'm always in touch with it. And when I write in Czech, I'm also always in touch with it, you know? And so that's the main thing, to be in touch with it and somehow to be concerned about like preserving good quality of the language, you know, because sometimes what we do when we live in a foreign country, we kind of substitute, like in your case, a German word by an English word, and you would say immediately, you know what I mean, right? You understand me. So, you know, if you do this too much, little by little, you know, your language will slip from you, you know.
Ben, in fact, you touched on one of my great fears, and that is, how long can I stay in the profession if I'm getting older and I'm so many years away from, in this case, American culture? And I suppose with American culture and language, it's probably easier because of television and books and the accessibility these days. But it is a question of mine. I've had this in mind, and I just translated something for American television. And I kept thinking the whole time, am I young enough and in touch enough with American culture to be able to do this job? It was a bit of a fear. But I discovered something that really helped me in another sense. I was reading Jessica Cohen's excellent translation of David Grossman's book. In English it's called To the End of the Land. And I wrote her at the end, after I'd read it, that I thought it was just a brilliant job. I felt like I was reading it in English, and I know David's work, and she did a stupendous job. And I had only one comment through that entire 600-page book. And it's something that made me feel really good, which is why I was also very happy to share it with her. And that was, I discovered she's young. She's a generation younger than I am. So she made an error, you know, as far as I was concerned, the one error in the book. And that was, she used a phrase that in something that was taking place in the 1970s did not exist yet. So I thought, oh, well, that's good to know. It's not only the old people who can err, it's the young people too. So, you know, we're all imperfect. So, you know, it's important to keep up with your language. It's important, I think, reading especially. But you're allowed to make mistakes here and there.
Jessica Cohen, I'd like to add, is also a PEN Translation Committee member. The next question is going to be to the lady here, and then we'll move around to other parts of the room. The lady here in front.
In terms of contracts, wouldn't you also want to warn against what I think are called the Ombudsman edition?
You'll have to explain that one to me.
That's when...
Could you hold the mic closer? We're not quite hearing you.
That's when a publisher can combine your work with those of other authors who may be inferior.
Oh, an omnibus edition. Omnibus, is that what you said?
I think that's what it's called. I may be wrong.
An anthology.
No, not strictly an anthology.
You mean a book containing works by several authors?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah. That the publisher, you know, has essentially repurposed the works.
Yeah, I've never actually come up with that issue before, but certainly, yeah, that among a number of other things are things you want to protect against. You want some, I mean, certainly, you know, the book should, unless you're translating for something that's going to be an anthology or an omnibus from the very beginning, you want to control those things. Those are what I would consider to be secondary or now the word is escaping me, but sort of secondary uses of your work for which you should be separately compensated. And, you know, your permission should be sought for that.
Okay, and the lady who yes.
Thank you. My name is Valerie, and I translate from Spanish. This is a question for Evan. Were you engaged in writing and translating before you made Aliyah? Were you in your English-speaking environment already thinking that way?
I'm a late bloomer. I should have been translating for many, many years, but what happened with me was that I came to translating through writing, and I didn't start to write until I was in my mid-30s because basically I was a perfectionist and thought I would never write anything that was as good as my own standards, so I short-circuited myself and never wrote anything. And when I finally gave myself permission in my mid-30s, that's when everything was unleashed, and that's when I sort of came to what I should have been doing all these years. I have no regrets about that, several years after I started writing, and I was working with an agent, she was the one who suggested that I start translating as well, and it was, for me, I don't know why I hadn't thought of it earlier. It's something I adore. I feel proud of my work that I do, and hope to be able to, you know, other than getting too old to speak English anymore, I hope to be able to continue doing it for many, many years to come.
Okay, Damien, over there in the back.
Thanks. I have a legal question and then also a general question, if that's okay. They'll be short. I wanted to ask about that issue of leverage because, I mean, there are the Edith Grossmans of the translation world who have it, and then there are the bigger publishers, like you mentioned. If Random House has acquired a book, then they're going to, you know, want someone that they want. And then I think a lot of literary translators are, first of all, approaching the smaller houses themselves. And so the publisher has no interest in translating the book unless you can talk them into it in the first place. So in practical terms, if one isn't Edith Grossman, how much leverage does one have?
Well, your leverage comes from the past. So you should, you know, if it's a first time out, you're obviously not going to be able to push that hard. Doesn't mean you shouldn't. Doesn't mean you should take the first offer that comes your way. But you're trying to build a career, and so that each new project should build upon the last one. So if in the last one you got what worked out to be $120 per 1,000 words, you want to try and bump that up. We're just talking about fees, and there are other things as well. You want to just keep building off of what you got before. And that means not being ashamed to ask for something you think nobody will ever pay. The worst they say is no, or more likely they'll say, well, we can't possibly pay that, but we can pay this. But at least now you've established something to work off of. It really, though, is just building a body of work and building off of that and taking each new project as an opportunity to extend your contract terms as well.
And the second really short question is about translator names on the title page. I'm just curious what your experience is, or maybe Susan also, what people think of that. That's the thing that I hear about it from American publishers, that nobody wants the translator's name on the title page. I'm sorry, not the title page, the front cover.
I don't sign a contract without that. And the publishers will tell you no, 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 and if you say I'm not signing without it, eventually they'll say okay.
I insist on it as well, sorry, for anyone. Doesn't matter, whether it's E.D. Grossman or anyone else.
The translator's name on the cover? I've
You
never even
seem shocked.
thought about this. I've never even thought about that issue. I've never asked for it because it wasn't even something that no. I mean, title page, absolutely. But cover of the book? No. I can't say I was ever interested. Oh, boy, am I going to walk away with this from a lot of new issues to deal with.
And a bio.
Non-issue.
And a bio.
I never had that.
And on the inside back cover. Ask for it. Keep asking for it.
But for example, in Spain, and I think not only in Spain, but all around Europe, it's like a guarantee. Sometimes it's a guarantee if it's a certain name, of a translator. So people will even buy it more, So sometimes really that especially like the quality publishers, they just make it a point to put the name of the translator at some visible place, right? So maybe at the cover, or like really at a visible place, because in the Czech culture they used to put the name of the translator in the back, in the credits, somewhere in the credits. So like only somebody who was extremely interested in, like had to take some special glasses, and look for it, So almost nobody did it, and it's true that that I think that little by little, really, it's very, very slow. The pace is extremely slow. I think it will probably need several lifetimes, but I think we are getting there. That the translators are being appreciated more.
The publishing professionals in the audience have noted that translator names on the book can actually help you sell your book. There was someone I acknowledged over here a moment ago. Who is, yes, next question over there. You, sir.
Hi, my name is Marco, and I have a question for the translators. I was wondering if you can talk a little bit more about your process. You touched upon some things, but if you can tell us a little more about your process. Perhaps you have a routine. How many drafts do you have? Do you consult with the authors often, or do you have co-translators sometimes, or things of that nature?
Well, this really varies from author to author, As I said, I always have these two examples, Kundera and Harabal, right? Because Kundera is, he is word for word, it's a word for word translation, so I cannot listen to any music while I'm translating, for example, right? And so it's like the first draft is usually valid, the words are valid, I work on the words very precisely, and then when I do the revision of the text, then more or less I look at the sentences, if the sentences are well built and if they make sense and all that, okay? When I translate Harabal, or when I, Harabal for example, that's a good example. I do listen to some music. I usually do listen to some music that I'm, classical music, something that I'm in the mood to listen to. I can work on it, for example, early in the morning when you're still in a kind of like subconscious state. He wrote very often when he was like blinded by the sun. So sometimes I try to translate like that, so that I would like recreate his mode of working. And actually, then I'm not very precise with the words, but I translate the atmosphere and I go very quickly, but then I have to do like several revisions where I really look at every word, if they were, if they are correct, if they really agree with the Czech original. So, like every translation, it's a different world, and what I try is to get into the skin of every author, like an actor that gets into a role, okay?
My process is pretty different. I thought we were going to say the same thing, but you veered off in a different direction. I also start with a first round, which is as close as I can make it to the original, even sacrificing English syntax to get exactly, as a writer, I know that a good writer, every word is on the page because he or she chose it to be there. And the sentence is structured that way for a reason. Unfortunately, not everyone writes that way, but really, I've had the great privilege of working mostly with writers who do operate that way. So I pay incredible attention to those words and that syntax. And I had a writer who had every paragraph was a sentence. There was no punctuation within the paragraph. And because that was a choice of his, I respected that. The second round that I do, I look at it I forget the Hebrew text and I look at it with English eyes, as it were, to make sure that this is now legible and flows properly for an English speaker. So that's my process. And in terms, I can't have any kind of interference, no music, nothing. People in the house bother me when I'm translating. They throw me off. So I really need a lot of silence for it. And my big issue with every book that I start, and I have this sort of nervousness at the start of every project, is, will I find the voice? Will I find the voice? Because the voice is everything. And it happened only once for a book that I wasn't actually commissioned to do. I was just interested in this book, and I tried a couple of pages, and I said, this is a book whose voice I will really never capture, and I'm not interested enough. It wasn't an act of ventriloquism that I thought I was either capable or particularly drawn to. But otherwise, I need to know that, and I can usually figure it out in the first 40 pages of reading. And that's another thing. I try not to read the whole book before I translate. I try and read 40 pages and then start to translate and stay about 20 pages ahead. Now, the thing is, it keeps me fresh that way. That was my logic, but I have a confession to make, which I only realized recently. The real underlying reason for that was that I'm such a slow reader in Hebrew that until I finished the book, life is pressing. I just didn't have enough time for that. So I would read has gotten me in trouble a few times. But what that means, though, is it does keep it fresh for me, but it also means that I have to go back at the beginning, at the end of the process, and pay particular attention to the beginning of the book, because I didn't understand everything that was going on in the book originally. So I need to go back and make sure that everything lines up and works in the way that the author intended.
Now, Evan, you've just given me my cue. While you two were answering questions behind your backs, they were giving me the out-of-time signal. I know that you have more questions. I invite you to come meet us at the book signing table to ask more questions so we can continue this discussion. I'd like to thank my wonderful panelists for coming out here, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you.